Gresham College presents Catholic Elegance and Joy by the Right Reverend Lord Harries of Pentragarth.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see people here again. Catholic Elegance and Joy. I'm focusing exclusively on two artists, Gill and David Jones, both very different from the artists we've considered before. Their importance, apart from their art, is that they thought more deeply about and were more troubled by the fundamental challenge facing artists in the 20th century who wanted to deal with some traditional iconography. And so particularly towards the end, there will be what you might call a little bit more intellectual content as we explore this, particularly in relation to David Jones. Gill lived from 1882 to 1940. He trained at Chichester Art and Technical School and then started to train as an architect in London. At the same time, he took evening classes in both stone cutting and calligraphy. In 1903, he gave up architecture to concentrate on these skills and became the most influential calligrapher, letter cutter, and type designer of the 20th century. Here are some examples of his typefaces, Perpetua, which he cut himself for a particular memorial, and Gill Sands, which was another of his famous typefaces. This is called Eve, 1929. Gill was influenced by the sculpture on South Indian temples as well as the Indian writer Ananda Coomaraswamy, and these influences, allied to his vast sexual appetite, gave much of his work a highly sensual quality. His highly active sexual life, unconventional, immoral, and illegal, is beyond the scope of this study, except for the point that a sensual elegance, and this is the point, a sensual elegance permeated all his work. He moved to Ditchling in 1907, and after the end of World War I, founded a Catholic artistic community, the Guild of St. Joseph and St. Dominic. And the name is significant. Joseph was a carpenter, and Gill highly prized the basic skills of making. St. Dominic is, of course, the founder of the Dominican order, whose vocation includes intellectual work. Gill was much influenced by the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain in his approach to art, and he himself wrote a great deal on the subject. In 1924, Gill and the community moved to Capeley Finn in the Black Mountains, and then in 1928 to Pigott's, a house in Speen near High Wycombe, where, amongst other work, Eric set up a press. As well as a number of memorials, Gill did some major public sculpture, such as 3 of the 8 studies of Wind, which is on what is now St. James's Park Underground Station, where Epstein's work also appears, as I showed you in the very first lecture. His best-known public sculpture is, however, Prospero and Ariel on Broadcasting House in Langham Place. Carved in the 1920s, there was a huge row over the size of Ariel's genitals, and Gill was forced to cut them off to make them much smaller. You'll all know that Gill work anyway. Gill's best-known religious work is his Stations of the Cross, which he did for Westminster Cathedral. This is Jesus and Veronica, as you can see, in 1914. So a word about his religious journey. Gill's father was originally ordained as a congregational minister, but rebelling against the doctrine of hell, joined the Countess of Huntingdon's Connection, a small sect that had separated from the Church of England but kept the prayer book. He then moved once again to become ordained in the Church of England. Eric Gill was one of a very large, poor, but basically happy family for whom religion was absolutely fundamental and taken for granted. When he joined the architect's office, however, he became a free thinker, as it was called then. His journey to Roman Catholicism and how it was integrated into his whole view of life is told in his autobiography. Here he makes great play of making up a new religion all for himself and then discovering to his surprise that it had been there all the time in the form of Roman Catholicism. Amongst all the other playful, paradoxical, and sometimes unconvincing reasons he gives for becoming a Catholic, what is clear looking at it from the outside is that Gill was by temperament a deeply religious person, and what Monsignor Ronald Knox said about himself, referring to his own relationship with his evangelical bishop father, is true of Gill. "I must have a religion," said Knox, "and it must be different from that of my father." In short, there is nearly always both continuity and discontinuity with our own religious upbringing. Now, his whole being was obviously moving in the direction of Catholicism for some time, drawn no doubt above all by its sacramental view of life, the way it held together the material and the spiritual. In the end, it was hearing some plain song in a Belgian monastery that convinced him. As he put it, "I knew infallibly that God existed, and God was a living God, just as I knew him in the answering smile of a child or in the living words of Christ." Gill experienced life with an extraordinary intensity, and sometimes the strength of his perception almost knocked him over. One such moment was the first time he saw his great friend and mentor engaged in calligraphy, as he wrote about this moment. "I did not know such beauties could exist. I was struck as by lightning, as by a sort of enlightenment. There are many occasions when, in a manner of speaking, you seem to pierce the cloud of unknowing, and for a brief second seem to know even as God knows. Sometimes when you're drawing the human body, even the turn of a shoulder or the firmness of a waist, it seems to shine with the radiance of righteousness." Now, it should also be noted that his Catholicism not only shaped his art and his whole approach to life, but his political views, leading him to be very fiercely anti-capitalist. Gill did many other religious carvings, crucifixes, and Madonnas using traditional imagery. This is a crucifix from 1910, which is in the Tate. This is another crucifix from 1913, also in the Tate. This is a Madonna and Child, now at Glastonbury. And some of the imagery is specifically designed to reinforce Catholic teaching and often uses imagery from the medieval period. Those of you who went to my lectures last year will remember that this is very much along the lines of the Volto Sancto in Lucca, Christ as the king and high priest on the cross. And there you see one of his prints, which clearly is there to convey Catholic teaching with the chalice and the host. Now, in addition to his carving, Gill also was very accomplished in his drawing. And this, combined with the calligraphy he did for a Bible, is wonderfully elegant and striking. And here are a few examples from the 4 Gospels, which he did in 1931. Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Jesus on the tree of Jesse. The shepherds worship the infant Jesus. And the wise men bring their gifts to the infant Jesus, where you can see that extraordinary elegance of design there and the sort of lyrical quality, almost the dance-like quality of it. Now, how are we to assess Eric Gill today? First, since the publication of Fiona McCarthy's biography of Gill in 1989, based on his highly intimate personal diaries, there is the old debate about the relationship between art and an artist's personal morality, question very pressing in the case of Gill, as to how he related his omnivorous sexual appetite to his Roman Catholicism, but as I've suggested, that will have to be put aside for now. Second, it is obvious that Gill was highly talented with an extraordinary capacity for elegance of line in all his work. And he combined this, as we've seen, with recognizably traditional imagery. And thirdly, it was clear from anyone who encountered Gill that he was a quite extraordinary and fascinating person who stood bravely in the face of the main trends of his time. And as I mentioned, he loathed capitalism and he believed in simple living and solid craftsmanship. Though he recognized his dependence on the art world to make a living, he despised the art for art's sake of the artistic elite of the time. He regarded all such art as simply an excrescence on the capitalism of his time, an art which was also infected by those false values of capitalism. But is this enough to make him a significant religious artist in the 20th century, when the whole tradition of belief and imagery had fragmented so badly? Does his work speak religiously to us? The best person to answer that question is David Jones, but I'm switching to another of a Gill one for you to look at, of his Stations of the Cross in Westminster. This is Jesus Receives the Cross. David Jones joined the Catholic fraternity with Eric Gill at Pigott's and then Capelli Finn, and Gill was a huge influence on him. But that influence did not affect the balance of Jones's judgment about Gill as an artist. He recognized that Gill was superbly talented as a letterer and that there's a wonderful linearity in all his work. But he did not think he was a great artist. This had less to do with any shortcomings in Gill himself than the cultural situation in which all artists then and now find themselves. For as we shall see when discussing Jones's own work, and as he put it in his essay on Gill, the best artists produce their work unself-consciously because they're integrated into a wider culture. Such a culture no longer exists, and the artist today is looked on as an agreeable extra, not an integral part of a wider cultural world. Jones thought that Gill, because of his talent, produced work that looked as though it might have been the product of a true culture, but it wasn't. Indeed, Gill himself recognized this. As remembered by Jones, he in effect said, "What I achieved as a sculptor is of no consequence. I can only be a beginning. It will take generations. But if only the beginnings of a reasonable, decent, holy tradition of working might be affected, that is the thing." Now, the other lack may have been Gill's steady focus on the linear rather than working in the round, and his overriding commitment to sheer elegance of line. Was this because of a reluctance to face fully the darkness and lostness of our time? Ours, perhaps, is not a time when all can be gathered into an elegant unity. So Jones wrote, "I don't think that one could say that the Stations at Westminster are profound works of sculpture, but they are adequate and right and the most live things in that fine interior. And number 12, in particular, which is this one, has great feeling and is a true icon." In the end, Jones gives a generous tribute to Gill. As he said, "The astonishing thing is that within certain bounds and in spite of all deficiencies, he achieved what he did achieve. The relative success is a surprise, not the obvious limitations." If Gill was aware of the limited achievement of his own art, he was no less generous and perceptive in his judgment about that of David Jones. Once round a crowded dining table, Gill remarked, "We've been talking a lot about art, but there's only one real artist in the room." He then pointed to David Jones. David Jones lived from 1895 to 1974. This is a portrait of him as Dye Greatcoat. David Jones was brought up in South London, but his father's side were Welsh, and this became of fundamental importance for both his art and poetry. He went first to the Camberwell Art School, but in 1915 enlisted in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. This was one of the three decisive experiences of his life, and from it came, but not until 20 years later, in 1937, his 126-page poem, In Parentheses. This has an introduction by T.S. Eliot in which he wrote, "On reading the book in typescript, I was deeply moved. I then regarded it, and I still regard it, as a work of genius. Its central figure is Di Greatcoat, the ordinary soldier in every battle in history, a name Jones gave for himself and the title of his published letters." After the war, he went to Westminster School of Art, and though admiring of Walter Sickert, who taught there, didn't really fit in, and in 1921 went to Ditchling in Sussex to visit Eric Gill, in whom he recognised a true master like William Morris. This immediately points to the other two formative experiences: his conversion to Roman Catholicism and his influence by and work with Eric Gill. David Jones was brought up in a devout Anglican home, but during the war he became, as he said, inwardly a Catholic, got into the habit of slipping into Mass when in Westminster, and formally converted in 1921. This is called Madonna and Child, by the way. This dates actually from 1921. David Jones had a natural talent, which his mother, who had also drawn in her younger school days, encouraged. This is a drawing he did at the age of 7. He said drawing was as natural to him as stroking a cat, and he decided at that age to be an artist. But there were other important influences in the family. His father was a printer's overseer, concerned with the appearance of the printed page, and his grandfather, one of them, a mast and block maker. And this craft side of him found expression when he first went to Eric Gill at Ditchling. Gill told him to start again with something that can be done with reasonable certainty, and he set Jones to work as a carpenter making looms. At Ditchling, David Jones became part of the Craft Guild of St. Joseph and St. Dominic, as I've mentioned, a community of Dominican tertiaries founded in 1919 by Hilary Pector and Eric Gill as a religious fraternity for those who make things with their hands. Jones was put to making looms. This was a life not only of work but of corporate prayer, with a philosophy of art shaped by the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. Jones turned out to be no great shakes as a carpenter, but the community was a pioneer in wood carving, and this became a natural medium for Jones. Wood engraving has the advantage of making the artist responsible for the whole process. There are no middlemen, and it forces a respect for the medium, as Gill put it. It had the further advantage for Jones of delivering him from the easy realism into which his natural talent flowed, to focus on the essential feeling as expressed in line and shape of what he was conveying. So that's Jesus Mocked from 1922-3, from that period. This is The Flight to Egypt from 1924. And this is an engraving for the book of Jonah, 1926. This is Petra. Jones lived with the Gill family, first at Ditchling, then at Capeley Finn in the Black Mountains, and then at their house Pigots near High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. He fell in love with Gill's daughter Petra, and they were engaged for 3 years, but then she decided to marry someone else. We see in this next picture, which is called The Garden Enclosed, dating from 1924, we see here an example of how Jones's religious themes permeate all his paintings. The title refers to Song of Songs 4:12, "A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse," a familiar image for the Virgin Mary. Geese, sacred to Juno, sound the alarm, a doll thrown down indicates the end of childhood. You won't be surprised that some writers have made great psychological play with this picture, and seen in Jones's sexual frustration and his refusal to carry forward his relationship with Petra or anybody else, the source of his later breakdowns. Capel y Ffyn is a wonderful spot in the heart of the Black Mountains, near the ruins of the ancient abbey of Llantoni. There was another religious house in the valley, and it was there that Gill and his entourage, including Jones, moved in 1924 to continue their community life of craft and prayer. It was here that Jones really discovered himself as a painter, not in oils, which was never his preferred medium, but in a mixture of watercolour and pen and ink. And the contours of the hills and valleys and flowing streams took shape in his artistic imagination. This is called Itumpa Nant Hondhi. This is the waterfall from Avon Hondhi Vak, 1926. For him, landscape was always sacramental, an outward and visible manifestation of the divine glory. So where others just see landscape, he sees Christ. And this is made clear in his later poem, Anathemata. Stands a lady on a mountain, who she is they could not know. Her waters were in her pale, her federal waters arced him. He by whom the welling fontes are from his paradise font mandated to make Grenfrowys glen de Frethwy, to crystal his ferned Hodney dale, dewy for de Frower, by this pre-clear and innocent creature. Now this needs some explanation. Hodney, and I should point out that all his poetry, which Eliot said were works of genius, are extremely, extremely difficult, not least because he uses about 10 Welsh words which require footnotes on every page. But they are clearly the work of genius. You just have to work very, very hard at it. Now this needs some explanation. Hodney is the same river as the Hondhi, after which Llantoni is named. And an earlier writer speaks of St. David drinking of the crystal Hodney. The stream is crystal clear, its banks are ferny, and David had a cell there. Idafrawa is the Welsh word for waterman, and David is called David the Waterman. So you can see that this painting, which would look like an ordinary landscape, for David Jones was absolutely suffused with religious and mythological and historical imagery. And that poem, which was written in 1952, is prefigured in his earlier landscapes like this one. And it is one of Jones's overriding themes, as I said, that landscape through the eyes of Christian belief and Welsh history and Welsh legend. Sanctus Christus de Capel y Ffyn, 1925. This is not so much a painting of the crucifixion scene as a wayside shrine in the Black Mountains. Christ's limbs are like the branches of a tree. His later lettering originated within paintings like this. This is called The Artist, 1927. From time to time, Jones went to stay with the monks in Caldy Island and painted some memorable scenes of the coast and sea. Here he imagined himself in the scriptorium, like a medieval limner copying ancient manuscripts. the hand of God above blessing his work, surrounded by animals. As in his landscapes, the sense of enclosure and the opening up to what is above and around interpenetrate one another. This is one of a series of engravings for the rhyme of the ancient mariner, the Albatross, 1929. It's a copper engraving. The albatross on the mast, which is the cross of Christ, is an image of Christ's sacrifice. And as Jones made clear, the ship is the church and the voyage is the journey of every human being, for which the sacrifice of the Mass pleads. This is called Nativity with Shepherds and Beasts Rejoicing. It's perhaps just important to note at this stage, although some of Jones's work, particularly some of his theorizing, can seem quite heavy, he believed that one of the prime functions, one of the essential functions of art was that it simply created pleasure and joy, and I think that does come across in this lovely nativity. This is called The Terrace, 1929. Now, it's possible for people to look at a Jones painting and say that's very pretty or attractive or whatever and move on. But that's a pity. First, Jones was a modernist, influenced not just in the early stage of his artistic life by Gill, but he was recognized as one of the leading avant-garde names of his time, with whom his work was exhibited as a member of the very select 7 and 5 Society to which he was elected. He kept in touch with London and what was going on there. Indeed, there are aspects of his work which seem related to Cézanne, Nash and Ben Nicholson and the Surrealists, amongst others. But all the time there is this distinctive vision and individual style. And that vision, as I stress, is, in a word, sacramental. He saw the outward and material reflecting the inward and spiritual. And he had an equally intense passion for both the material and the spiritual. He wanted to express the universal through the particular. The challenge for him was how to achieve this. To do justice to the spiritual, he needed to eschew realism. As he lamented to one friend, "Isn't it awful, these yards of able paintings of various kinds that seem only seen with the eye of the flesh?" Yet abstraction took him away from the particular, which always so excited him. He writes in one letter about being demented trying to capture the beauty of a new garden on which he'd made 4 or 5 attempts. Now, his solution was to go for watercolor, but in a highly distinctive way. First, with a strong grounding of white, which gave the painting a translucent character. Then to use drawing not just as a preparation for the painting, as painters since the Renaissance have tended to do, but as an essential aspect of the painting itself. And finally, through his use of line work, to give a sense of fluidity and movement to the whole. As Paul Hill puts it about an early painting, but which is applicable to Jones's whole oeuvre, the organization of shapes is not the sole source of unity. The individual marks of pencil and brush share a distinctive character, irregular yet rhythmic, tremulous yet bold. Individually, these marks may appear graceless and undisciplined, even messy, yet at the right distance they signal across the paper in vibrant patterns. The matrix of white paper is crucial to this essentially linear art. The character of each touch must tell. And he took to heart the postmodernist dictum that a painting should not be an impression of anything, but existing in its own right. But what he wanted to exist in its own right, he wanted to show as imbued with a greater reality, as something more, an excess, as he put it. Now, in addition to these essentially technical accomplishments, is added the matter of content, the way he imbues his paintings with historical or mythical significance. And this, you see this in this other one, a similar type of painting, Mana O'Aidan's Glass Door, 1931. For the title refers to a figure in the Mabinogion, the collection of Welsh folk tales, this figure who shut himself away from passing time and the harsh reality of the world. When he eventually went through the door to take up his responsibilities, he experienced all the pain and sorrow of the world again. Now, it seems no accident that it was at this time that Jones wrote in parentheses his account of being a soldier in the First World War. And here, the pattern of the carpet flows into the blood-red sea anemones of the shore. The ocean gives the feeling of rocking on a ship, yet the frame of the window gives a sense of stillness and stability in the midst of movement, and the ship of life sails onward. All in all, as he put it about his paintings, I should like to speak of a quality which I rather associated with the folk tales of Welsh or Celtic derivation. A quality congenial and significant to me in some oblique way, has some connection with what I want in painting. I find it impossible to define, but it has to do with a certain affection for the innate creatureliness of things, a care for and appreciation of the particular genius of places, men, trees, animals, and yet withal a pervading sense of metamorphosis and mutability. The trees are men walking, that words bind and loose material things. He went on to refer to the Alice in Wonderland book, to indicate how things can be metamorphosed in strange, haunting ways. Jones certainly had a strong sense of place, and indeed almost thought in terms of the spirit or spirits of the place, but in Christian terms, especially Mary. But this was also linked to his sense that everything is on the move, on the way, being changed. And it's all this that he's trying to convey in these sort of paintings. This is called Epiphany, 1941, Britannia and Germania Embracing. Jones did a front piece for, in parentheses, that showed a common soldier like John Bunyan's pilgrim bearing his burden, and an end piece that showed a lamb or perhaps a scapegoat caught in a crown of thorns made of barbed wire. It was dedicated, amongst others, to, quotes, the enemy front fighters who shared our pains, against whom we found ourselves by misadventure. Typically kind of Jones' way of putting it. Against whom we found ourselves by misadventure. Epiphany 1941, which is this one, is inscribed, O sisters too, what may we do? A line taken from the Coventry Carol, which was associated with the massacre of the Innocents, obviously referring to the destruction of Coventry Cathedral by German bombs in November 1940. The spire of the cathedral is on the left. If I can, somewhere up there, I think, if I can see it. Germania wears antlers, as if they were mummers enacting the sacrifice of the tree god, according to German folk tales. The dogs howl and the birds whirl overhead, but a lighthouse blinks steadily. Can you see the lighthouse? The lighthouse is somewhere over... Yeah, there we are. There's the lighthouse. But a lighthouse blinks steadily. Not long before the war, the lighthouse had been added to penny coins, so it serves here as a sign of Britannia and of the Virgin Mary, Stella Maris, day star of the harbour, and Eliot's Lady whose shrine stands on the promontory. Now you can see, this is a theme which really will merge with even more strongly, is Jones tries to get so much mythological and other significance in his paintings. They do become quite crowded. And this one is particular. This is called Aphrodite in Aulis, 1941. Originally called simply Aphrodite, Jones then took the title of Euripides, the Greek playwright, Iphigenia in Aulis, and changed it. Now, there's highly complex symbolism here, and he said, my intention in changing Aphrodite in the title was to include all female cult figures. The figure is all goddesses rolled into one, wounded of necessity, as all things worthy of our worship. She's mother figure, and Virgo inter virgins, the pierced woman and mother of all her four types. He then gives examples of these. The moon and stars are attributes of the Madonna in the book of Revelation. Doves are sacred to Aphrodite. They add their chorus to the confusion of sacred and physical love, which is the essential theme. Here you'll see a mixture of architectural styles to show that she belongs to all ages. Marble goddess in the sacred enclosure. And the particular pictorial clue is crucifixion, the lance of Longinus, the German soldier. I think you can see that. I can't see them very well from here, but I think you'll find the lance up there somewhere. The statue's cracked and broken, and the mass, the lamb, bleeds into the chalice. I think under there somewhere. Soldiers on both sides are united in a love that is both sacred and profane. So this is rooted in his own experience and for him was of universal meaning. You can see there he's trying to cram so much in there. The female figure includes within herself all cult goddesses, all female figures. But she's on a broken statue because she expresses a love which is both sacred and profane. But at the heart of all this is the crucifixion and the sacrifice of the Mass, which is redeeming the world in all its aspects. This is called Vexilla Regis, 1947. In 1947, he suffered the second of his major but mysterious breakdowns. During long months in the nursing home, he started to draw the trees in the grounds, trees which had been important to him since he was wounded in World War I, and as also is reflected in his poem In Parenthesis. Vexilla Regis is full of complex symbolism, which he explained in a long letter to a friend. But he also indicated it was all fluid and could not be tied down. But the essential theme is the cross of Christ as a great tree, the theme of the great 4th century hymn, Vexilla Regis, which we sing, some of us, on Good Friday. But this tree grows out of a collapsing Roman world. Cavalry horses are set loose and can be seen somewhere in the picture. I think they're down here somewhere. The armor is lying around. The tree on the right, at once the tree of the bad thief and a Roman column, with a dove above it, indicating this too could be redeemed. The other tree with a pelican. This is Glass Chalice and Mug, 1952. After his breakdown in 1947, he wanted to stay near the nursing home where he'd been treated, and the house where he lodged, Northwick Lodge, remained his home until 1964. Here he began to draw again, and in particular did a large number of drawings of flowers in a glass on his table. He liked the word calyx because of its link with the chalice. And this next one is called Chalice with Flowers, 1950. And he liked the image of water as both the origin of life and the water of baptism. Kenneth Clark wrote in 1967, "Some of the finest of David Jones's recent paintings are not of literary subjects, but represent a simple glass of flowers on a table. A pleasant subject, but we are not for long under the illusion that this is an ordinary still life." He then refers to the imagery, chalice, altar, the different colours of the flowers representing parts of the Eucharist. Quotes, "Every flower is there for a dozen reasons, visual, iconographical, or even on account of its name. and how far they can be interpreted as Christian imagery, no one, perhaps not even the painter, can tell. And Paul Hills has written, though he was to paint for another 10 years, the chalice drawings represent a peak that David Jones never surpassed. Let's have a look at another one. It's called Flora in Calyx Light, 1950. In them, says Paul Hills, the universal shines forth from the particular. Through visible forms, we are caught up into the love of things invisible. And he quotes some words of Jones himself. Cézanne said, we must do Poussin again after nature. Perhaps we might also say we must do Cézanne's apples again after the nature of Julian of Norwich's little nut, which, quotes, endureth and ever shall, for God loveth it. Rowan Williams, referring to a painting of Jones, translated into English as the Annunciation, has commented in relation to the chalice paintings, at this level, there is no difference between this explicitly religious picture and Flora in Calyx Light, which is this one. This is how you paint excess, by the delicate superimposing of nets of visual material in a way that teases constantly by simultaneously refusing a third dimension and insisting that there's no way of reading the surface at once. As in the Byzantine icon, visual depth gives way to the time to take to read a surface, and you cannot construct a single consistent illusion of depth as you look, and so you're obliged to trace and retrace the intersecting linear patterns. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. From the 1940s, Jones experimented with inscriptions, not to imitate any style in the past, but to express his own highly personal vision. This is a fairly early one from Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, and the concept of the once and future king was one of the myths that permeated his work. And it has been well said of his inscriptions, he is a bard, a carpenter of stone, and a celebrant. He was a maker of shapes and forms, and the inscriptions were often useful artifacts, as well as pure art, devotional aids used like mass cards on the altar to help him through his daily office. Jones had bridged the gap between the Ditchling ethos and the more abstract art of his contemporaries, and he did it without losing sight of his civilizational predicament. For the letters which make up the inscriptions often appear embattled, a purely formal expression of struggle and loss. I want to try to say something a little bit more in detail now about Jones's whole approach to art, because it's pretty fundamental, and he's thought more deeply and more agonizingly about this than any other Christian artist of the 20th century. For David, Jones has suggested, the whole of life was sacramental, the outward and visible revealing the inward and spiritual. But he also made a distinction between utile and extra utile, if you like to translate that into more accessible language, into what is obviously practically useful and that which has no obvious practical use. He contrasts the ordered line of a Roman legion, which has a definite purpose, and the ordered line of a hexameter, which is a thing wholly extra utile and explicable only as a sign. But what is it that makes a particular production a work of art? For him, absolutely essential, it is the element of pure form. And it is important to remember, as I've stressed before, that Jones was and remained all his life, both in his painting and poetry, a modern, understood as someone concerned above all with form. He thought a human being is essentially a seeker of form, venata forarum, and he referred to the splendor of forms. But this form exists in art as a sign, because art has no obviously practical function and therefore exists as a sign. Now, again, this sign-making has a wider reference. For human beings, according to Jones, are essentially sign makers. Most obviously, we give someone a bunch of flowers or kiss as a sign. So, what are works of art a sign of? And here we come across the great crisis with which Jones wrestled both in his writing and his art, and may indeed have contributed significantly to his breakdown. For he believed, and he said this view was shared by his contemporaries in the 1930s, that the 19th century experienced what he called the break. And by this he meant two things. First, the dominant cultural and religious ideology that had unified Europe for more than 1,000 years no longer existed. All that was left were fragmentary individual visions. Secondly, according to him, the world is now dominated by technology, so that the arts seem to be marginalized. They had no use in such a society, and their previous role as signs no longer had any widespread public resonance. As he put it, their work was idiosyncratic and personal in expression and experimental in technique, intimate and private, rather than public and corporate. The priest and the artist are already in the catacombs, he wrote, but separate catacombs, for the technician divides to rule. There's no corporate tradition, and one could not be looked for without the renewal of the whole of our culture. And writing after World War II, he remarked that the situation at that time was even more pronounced and dire than it had seemed to him in the 1930s. Now, this general understanding of the arts and their role in society was for him focused and underpinned by his Christian, and more specifically by his Roman Catholic faith, which came together in his understanding of the nature of art. There was, first of all, a personal revelation for him just before and after the First World War, when he came to understand the meaning of post-impressionism. It made him realize that art was not meant to be an impression of anything, any more than it was, or something, any more than it was meant to be a representation of something. It was a work in its own right, quotes, representing something in the medium of paint or stone or whatever. And this was about the same time as he became a Catholic. And he saw the Mass in similar terms to the way he saw art, because the sacrifice of the Mass represented under the form of bread and wine, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. So he came to think that what happened in the Mass, as it were, defined and undergirded all works of art, because they are also representations. And that's why all his work, particularly some of his later work, it is the Eucharist, which is the all-pervading theme, whatever other details are present. And art, as I said, can be justified only as signs of something, to quote him. They are evocative, are incantive, and have the power of recalling or bringing to mind, are in fact one with the whole world of sign or sacrament, whether it be the flowers sent to Clio on her birthday or the profound intention of the art of the man at the altar, the work known as amanuensis, an effectual recalling. But he also believed that artists must live in contact with the art and culture of their present and the past. What was one of the features which was distinctive about Jones, though, compared with many of his contemporaries, and that is that he wanted his art to be as inclusive as possible, and that's why we often get what seems to us a profusion of images, because he wanted to include within his Catholic faith the whole sort of motivation towards the spiritual and all that can be celebrated in human life. And as he had himself had a very wide range of reference, and a lot of things had made a big impression on him, he somehow wanted to bring all this into his painting and his poetry. He wanted to include all that was interest to him, everything that was lying about in his mind. And he quotes the early British historian Nennius, "I have made a heap of all I could find." Now, he did not, as I said, he did not condemn modern art at all. He was a defender of abstract art, indeed, right to the end of his time, even though his art had moved on into something more slightly different. This is Portrait of a Maker. He did two major self-portraits, one called Human Being in 1931, this Portrait of a Maker in 1932. But these are not, in fact, portraits as we normally understand them, for they're highly stylized to bring out particular points. The human being, suspended between maturity and childhood, as it's been put, is also suspended between individuality and archetype. And we notice the prominence given to the ears, the eyes looking somewhere else, the prominent, delicate hands of a maker. In terms of specific examples, this understanding of art meant, for example, more widely now, that a word like wood, which once had a huge cultural resonance in relation to the wood of the cross, now for most people had none. Yet David Jones felt it his vocation to be in touch with that tradition, but in a modern way. And this was true both of his poetry and his painting. As he wrote, if one is making a painting of daffodils, what is not instantly involved? Will it make a difference whether or no we've heard of Persephone or Flora or Blothiath? He asserts it does make a difference, but for those who've not heard of them, they would in fact paint daffodils, quotes, as though they had invoked her name. So what we've seen, that although some of David Jones' paintings seem fairly straightforward, for him they were loaded with artistic and mythological and religious significance. And I think that the estimate of Jones in the end as a painter probably has to wait for a few generations. There's no doubt about it. I think that if your reaction is anything like mine, we find some of those later paintings have too much detail. They're difficult really to grasp the sort of central point of them. But as I say, one of the main features of reasons for dealing with David Jones is that he did wrestle more agonizingly with this huge issue of what he called the break than any other artist. And he wrote brilliantly about it, as well as trying to respond to the challenge in paint. And at that point, I think I'm going to open up for some discussion and questions.
Did he make any sort of living for himself from his work? How successful in a monetary terms did he manage?
He wasn't very successful. He did sell some of his work, but he was the kind of person whom his friends just wanted to help. So I think he was supported quite a lot of the time, I think, by friends who just hugely admired and loved him. Obviously, he sold some, but probably not enough to live on unless he'd had some other help.
It's the first time I've seen any of David Jones's pictures, but it struck me a lot of the ones that contained symbolism. They were very, very similar to some of the ones that you showed us of Chagall.
I mean, it is true, you're absolutely right. Both painters, both sets of paintings are steeped in symbolism. I think it'd be true to say, though, that, of course, Chagall's are more obviously arresting because of the colours are so vivid and the images are so startling, you know, cows flying in the sky and so on. But you're quite right that both are steeped in symbolism. But whereas Chagall's symbolism is drawn from his Jewish childhood primarily, together also with some Christian iconography, as you will remember, Jones's use of symbolism just went so much wider than that. He drew on Welsh history, Welsh legend, Christian symbolism from all age, and tried to bring it all in, because that's what, when he looked at a landscape, that's what he saw. Any others, or is that enough for now, right? Unless there's anybody desperate, I think we'll call that a halt. Thank you very much. Oh, just to mention that the January lecture is on the theme of the post-World War II revival of confidence. Because what suddenly happened after World War II is that artists began to get commissions to do work in Christian buildings, of which, of course, the most obvious one is Coventry Cathedral. So there's that sudden renewal of confidence, and we'll be looking at some of the artists associated with that post-war renewal of confidence.
Happy Christmas.
And thank you very much.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.